Michael Harper, a successful black entrepreneur, was denied a loan from the very bank he owns. The biased consultant had no idea who he was dealing with. What Michael did next will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Michael Harper, elegantly dressed and exuding quiet confidence, approached the glass doors of the bank. His steps were assured, though inside he felt a slight tension. Every visit to a financial institution always brought mixed emotions. As a young African American, Michael had faced racial prejudice at every stage of his career. But today, he felt particularly confident. His business was thriving, and he needed a loan to fuel further growth. As soon as Michael stepped into the bank's spacious lobby, the cool air from the air conditioner, filled with the scent of polished wood and fresh documents, enveloped him. He approached the consultant's desk. Behind it sat a middle-aged man with short-cropped hair, Thomas Miller. His eyes lingered on Michael for a brief moment, during which an almost imperceptible shadow of distrust hung in the air. But Thomas quickly adopted a professional demeanor, pretending not to notice anything unusual. "Good afternoon. I'm Michael Harper. I have an appointment about a business loan," Michael said calmly, extending his hand in greeting. Thomas froze for a second, looking Michael up and down, then reluctantly shook his hand. "Yes, Mr. Harper," he replied in a slightly strained voice. "Please, have a seat." Michael sat down in the chair across from the consultant's desk. Thomas quickly skimmed through the documents, casting a brief glance at Michael's business plan. Thomas's expression grew more skeptical, a change that did not go unnoticed by Michael. "So," Thomas began, furrowing his brow, "your credit history seems to be in order, but tell me, Mr. Harper, what exactly do you plan to use this loan for?" Michael, prepared for this question, calmly began explaining. "I'm expanding a network of tech startups, and this loan will allow me to increase production and open new offices in major cities." But instead of delving into the details of the project, Thomas abruptly changed the subject. "And do you have any personal assets that could serve as additional collateral? You understand, with this level of risk, it's standard practice." Michael suppressed his irritation. He had already presented all the necessary documents, showing that his company was stable and profitable, but Thomas seemed to be ignoring the facts. "All the information about my assets has already been provided to you," Michael responded calmly. "My company is successful, and I'm confident in my strategy. This loan is for growth, not to cover any debts or risks." Thomas frowned and, without saying a word, began filling out some forms, occasionally glancing sideways at Michael. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute. "I'm afraid, Mr. Harper," Thomas finally said, putting down his pen, "our bank won't be able to approve your loan. We believe the risks are too high. I suggest you explore other financing options." Michael felt his heart slow. He knew this wasn't about risks or his business. It was about how he looked, and once again, his skin color had become a barrier. Nevertheless, he nodded, masking his frustration with a calm exterior. "Understood," he replied shortly, standing up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller." As Michael left the bank, emotions churned inside him. He knew he would return, but next time in a completely different role. Michael stepped out of the bank, and the cold autumn wind instantly brushed his face. He walked down the street, trying not to succumb to the growing feelings of resentment and anger. Thomas's refusal wasn't just a business matter. It was another reminder of the systemic injustice Michael had faced his entire life. Returning home, he sat on the couch and thought. His eyes rested on a family photo of him with his parents in their old home. Michael's father, a mechanic with rough hands and kind eyes, had always taught him not to give up, no matter the obstacles. "You have to be better than they think and stronger than you seem," his father often said. Those words echoed in his mind, but this time they brought no comfort. Michael ran his hand over his face, recalling all the moments when his talent and achievements were ignored simply because of the color of his skin. Back in school, his teachers doubted he could succeed in STEM fields. Later, during his college applications, his candidacy was frequently questioned despite his outstanding grades and accomplishments. Even when his startup became profitable, Many investors treated him with caution. This loan refusal was the last straw. At that moment, his wife Laura entered the room. She had been Michael's support throughout all the years of their life together. Tall, with a confident stride and a calm voice, she could instantly read her husband's mood. "What happened?" she asked, sitting next to him and touching his hand. Michael sighed heavily. "The bank refused the loan," he said shortly. "It's the same old story. Thomas Miller looked at me as if I came begging for charity instead of investing in the company's growth." Laura frowned, understanding that the rejection was about more than just numbers. "Racism again, huh?" she asked quietly. "They didn't even give you a chance?" Michael nodded. "Everything was decided before I even sat down. They don't look at our achievements. I could be a millionaire, but to them, I'll always be just a black guy who doesn't fit in. It's frustrating. Every time I feel like I'm fighting an invisible wall." Laura listened intently, but there was a fire in her eyes. She knew Michael wasn't someone who would back down in the face of injustice. "You have to do something about this, Michael," she said confidently. "You own this bank. You've put your heart into this business, and they don't even realize they're refusing you, their boss. This is your moment to show them who you really are." Michael thought about her words. She was right. He wasn't just a man asking for a loan. He was the owner of the bank. A surge of determination rose within him. "You're right, Laura," he finally said, standing up. "I need to act. I won't let them dismiss me like that and continue as if nothing happened." Laura smiled, feeling her words had struck a chord. "You're not alone in this fight. We've already overcome so much together, and I know you'll do the right thing." Michael looked at her with gratitude. This moment was a turning point for him. He was no longer someone who would just accept life's blows. He was ready to fight for justice, not only for himself, but for everyone facing similar obstacles. The decision was made. Michael would return to the bank, but this time as the owner, and show Thomas and the entire bank that their biases would not go unpunished. With these thoughts, he began preparing for the meeting, knowing that ahead lay not just a personal victory, but an important step in fighting systemic discrimination. The next day, Michael Harper walked into the bank, but this time his steps were filled with confidence and determination. He was no longer just a client. Today, he was going to show everyone that he owned this financial institution, and that people like Thomas Miller could not act with bias and impunity. Michael entered the bank, his black suit perfectly tailored, and his face maintained a calm, composed demeanor. He was accompanied by lawyers and several senior bank executives. They were all aware of the situation and had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. The door to Thomas Miller's office was slightly ajar, and Michael knocked decisively before entering without waiting for an invitation. Thomas looked up from his paperwork, his face momentarily frozen in surprise before he resumed his usual slightly arrogant expression. "Mr. Harper," Thomas said with a forced smile, "I assume you're back regarding the loan?" Michael approached the desk, standing tall without sitting down, surveying the office. He held himself with such confidence that a chill ran down Thomas's spine, though he tried not to show it. "Not quite," Michael responded calmly. "I'm here to discuss the management of this bank." Thomas frowned slightly, not understanding what was being said. "Management of the bank?" he repeated, glancing at the papers in front of him, clearly trying to figure out what game Michael was playing. "The fact is, Thomas," Michael began, still composed, "I am the owner of this bank, and I'd like to talk to you about how you make decisions regarding loans." Thomas froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his confidence faltering. "You can't be the owner. Is this a joke?" Michael gave a quiet chuckle and pulled out a few documents from his folder. He handed them to Thomas. The consultant took the papers with trembling hands and quickly skimmed through them. His face turned pale as the blood drained from his cheeks. He realized that the man standing before him truly was the owner of the bank. I didn't know," Thomas began, fumbling for words, but Michael stopped him with a raised hand. "Of course you didn't know," Michael continued, his voice steady. "And that's exactly the problem. You didn't take me seriously because you judged me the moment you saw me. But what matters now isn't that. What matters is that your bias affects the decisions you make, and that's unacceptable." Thomas struggled to gather his thoughts, but he felt his position slipping away. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "This was a misunderstanding. I was just following protocol." Michael kept his gaze steady, his expression unchanging. "This isn't just a misunderstanding, Thomas. It's a systemic issue. And if you can't make decisions without bias, we will have to reconsider your place at this bank." Silence filled the room. Thomas realized that his career was hanging by a thread. He thought back to all his previous client interactions and suddenly became aware that this wasn't an isolated incident. Too often, he had made decisions based on stereotypes and appearances rather than objective data. "I'm willing to fix this," Thomas said quickly, trying to salvage the situation. "I'll review my approach. I'll work hard." Michael studied him carefully. "You'll have the chance to prove that. We're going to implement new training programs for staff to ensure that situations like this never happen again, and it will be your responsibility to oversee that no one else experiences discrimination in this bank." Thomas nodded, his face filled with embarrassment and anxiety. He understood that he'd been given a chance to make amends, but his reputation would now depend on every step he took. Michael turned to leave, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He knew this moment was important, not just for him, but for the entire bank structure. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step forward in the fight against systemic injustice. Before leaving, Michael gave Thomas one final look. "Remember this day, Thomas. We all have the capacity to change if we choose to. Don't waste this chance." Thomas sat at his desk, staring at the documents in his hands. His world had turned upside down. He now knew he could no longer afford to continue acting the way he had. As Michael exited the bank, he felt a sense of lightness and inner strength. He had taken the first step toward changing the system, and he was determined to keep moving forward. After his confrontation with Thomas, Michael returned home feeling a sense of closure. But he knew this was only the first step on a much larger journey. It was clear to him that the system he had confronted was deeply embedded in society, and it would take more than just exposing one biased consultant to bring about real change. The next day, changes began at the bank. Michael called a meeting with the board of directors and announced that the bank would implement new management principles, including employee training to combat bias and discrimination. He didn't stop at words. He immediately brought in diversity and inclusion experts to develop training programs for all bank staff. Michael was determined. Incidents like the one with Thomas must never happen again. He wanted to create an environment where people were judged on their professional merits, not by stereotypes. His drive to change the situation came from the heart, as he knew firsthand how difficult it was to overcome barriers built by an unjust system. Thomas Miller, still stunned by the previous day's events, realized that his career now depended on how well he could adapt to the new environment. Under the close watch of his colleagues and superiors, he accepted Michael's offer to be part of the new training program. It was his chance not only to keep his job, but also to rethink his values. Weeks passed, and a new culture began to take root in the bank. Employees became more aware of how they interacted with clients, and training on inclusivity helped them uncover biases they hadn't even realized they had. Thomas attended every session, listening intently as experts spoke about systemic racism and the importance of treating all people equally. He began to understand that his views weren't solely the result of personal beliefs, but also of the society in which he had been raised. This realization shook him to the core. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt that changing himself wouldn't be a sign of weakness, but rather a mark of strength. He realized that true strength lay in recognizing one's mistakes and working to correct them. Several months after the new programs were implemented, Michael noticed significant changes in the bank's atmosphere. Employees were more open, and clients, particularly African Americans, felt confident that their applications would be evaluated fairly. Many new customers seeking loans and other financial services now trusted that they would receive unbiased consideration. One day, Thomas approached Michael in the bank's hallway, while Michael was reviewing the results of the new initiatives. "Michael," Thomas began, his voice filled with both embarrassment and determination. "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance. These months of training have been challenging, but they've opened my eyes. I've rethought a lot and realized how important it was to change not only my attitude, but the entire system I've worked in." Michael looked at him and nodded slightly. "I'm glad you've understood, Thomas, but this is just the beginning. We still have a long way to go to change not only our bank, but society as a whole." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the truth in those words. He felt he had become part of something bigger, a movement for justice and equality. Michael and Thomas's story soon spread beyond the bank. Media outlets began writing about how one man had managed to change not only himself, but an entire organization by introducing new standards of inclusivity. Michael's story inspired other entrepreneurs, and the wave of change spread to other banks and corporations. Michael knew this was only the beginning of his mission. He was no longer just a businessman. He had become a symbol of change and justice, a man who had not only achieved personal success, but had also opened doors for others. This victory was not just his own, but a triumph for everyone who had ever faced bias and discrimination. Michael knew new challenges lay ahead, but he was now ready to face them with the resolve and strength that his fight for justice had given him.